Well, welcome everybody to the Full Press Commanders podcast. My name is George Carmi. Let's get it on. What's up, everybody? It's George Carney from the Full Press Commanders podcast. I'm here with my man Mark Bullock today. How you doing, Mark?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing very, very well. So I'm very pleased to have Mark today. Mark is formerly a writer of The Athletic and The Washington Post. And honestly, he's someone that I really admire in regard to his work. I think he produces good content. He has a good eye for football. And I'm just happy to hear him, man. So thank you for joining me. Appreciate that.
Yeah, of course, no worries. It's a very kind word, so thank you.
No problem. So Mark, before we dive into the draft, right? Today's going to be our NFL draft recap and kind of talking about how Washington made out. Personally, I'm curious, how did you get into football? Like, you're out in the UK, aren't you?
I am, as you can probably tell from the accent, but I lived in the States when I was younger for 5 years. My dad's job took us over to the States for a few years, and I grew up with some American sports, and then we moved back to England, and I kind of fell out of US sports a little bit, but and kind of went with the normal football or soccer over here, and a couple other sports here. And then as I got to my 20s, the NFL started being shown more and more regularly on TV here, and I kind of picked back into that. And I've always really liked kind of, rather than the shouting and screaming at the referees, why are you doing this? And what is that player doing? He's rubbish, and this kind of thing. I would kind of like sit back and think, well, why did this thing happen? And why did that player make that mistake? And the NFL, because each play is drawn up and designed specifically with different assignments in mind, that's always played into that kind of mindset that I've had. So it kind of naturally piqued my interest, and kind of went from there. I just kept watching more and more of it and trying to learn myself as much as I could, and yeah, went from there.
Ah, gotcha. So the $1 million question is, why the Washington Redskins? Why the Commanders out of all NFL teams?
Because
Go
when
ahead.
we were out there, my dad's job took us just outside DC.
Gotcha.
So it was. I wouldn't say growing up I supported any of the DC teams or any teams really. I just kind of liked the big name players, as you do as a kid. But when I came back here and got back into the US sports, I kind of naturally felt like, well, I spent some time near DC. I might as well go for the DC sports teams.
What was your generation? Was it the Posse and then Mark Rippon and all that? Or were you a little bit afterwards or
No, a little
beforehand?
bit after that. I'm only 30, and I started getting in the game about 10, maybe 15 years ago. So
Okay.
the kind of real first swing of it was when Shanahan, kind of Jim Zorn, just a little bit at the end of Jim Zorn, and when Mike Shanahan came in is when I really kind of started getting really into the X's and O's stuff. So obviously there was the RG3 stuff, and that was the kind of generation that I kind of, I guess, grew up in the sport watching.
Gotcha. Were you team Shanahan or team RG3 and the whole dynamic over there?
I think when the stories come out that basically everyone seems to be on the Shanahan side from most people that were in that locker room, and seem to know what happened, it's kind of hard to be on the RG3 side. So as much as I liked RG3 and he seemed like a nice guy, and he was electric that rookie year. It seems like more of the truth is in the Shanahan side.
I gotcha. All right, so we're about to start heading towards the NFL draft. I want to get your perspective on the prospects. I know, like, you have an awesome Substack that everyone should definitely tune in and subscribe to and read about. Before we get into the draft, what's your overall perceptions of the team? Do you think the team's moving in the right direction? Were you a big fan of the Wentz trade? Are you a fan of Rivera? Where are you at right now?
I wasn't a huge fan of the Wentz trade when it initially happened. I kind of understand why they did it, and certainly he is an upgrade over what they had. And I think it takes them to a certain level. And in this division, given the schedule they should have this year, which on paper is a lot easier, and hopefully they have less injuries, then it should do for them what it needs to do for the likes of Rivera and the two Martys to keep their jobs and keep building the team. So I personally I do like Ron Rivera, and obviously he's a
Mm-hmm.
great character, and he was the right guy at the right moment for this organization in
Mm-hmm.
terms of trying to establish a culture. I do believe that. Do I necessarily believe that he's going to take them to the Super Bowl? Probably not, but I think he can certainly, if in an ideal world, Schneider is forced to sell the team and someone else comes in and Rivera gets his culture established, then maybe the next guy from Rivera has a much better foundation to go from and get Washington back into, competing for actual, worthwhile things rather than maybe a playoff, a wild card spot.
I agree with you. I think Rivera is more of like, remember the old Buccaneers team where like Tony Dungy kind of set up that culture, kind of get them everyone set up, and then John Gruden kind of sealed the deal. I
Yeah,
feel like Ron Rivera is a type of coach to kind of like build our culture, get our team kind of established, and it's become more of a professional organization. And
for
ideally,
sure.
he'll probably step back and have more of like a young up and comer come in and kind of seal the deal over there. So I agree with you there. So let's talk about the draft. So going into the draft, what did you think? What were some of Washington's biggest needs in your opinion? And do you think? Let's start off with that. What were their biggest needs in your opinion?
So I think obviously they needed a lot of the positions that they ended up drafting.
Hmm.
I felt like wide receiver is one where you could kind of go either way. You could say
Hmm.
that if Curtis Samuel's back healthy, we think he and McLaurin are good starters, and De'Ami Brown could take another step forward,
Hmm.
and Cam Sims has shown some stuff, and they liked what Dax Milne got them last year as a kind of developmental guy. And you could say those are 5 solid prospects, and you could justify that, I think. But I
Hmm.
think also you could just as easily turn around and say, well, Curtis Samuel didn't stay healthy last year, and if even if he is, he can go back into the slot if you need a guy on the outside or vice versa. And then De'Ami Brown, didn't quite live up to expectations, but even if he does take a step forward, more competition is never a bad thing, and you need that other receiver alongside Terry McLaurin to help
Hmm.
take some of the pressure off him. So I think you could justify that. I don't necessarily think it was their biggest need. I think
Hmm.
obviously we spent most of the offseason talking about quarterback, which they addressed with Wentz, and then
Hmm.
a Mike linebacker, and then that kind of shifted when Mayhew and Rivera started talking about Cole Holcomb playing the mic again, despite at the end of the year they were saying that Cole Holcomb couldn't play that spot.
Exactly. Kind of, kind of.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's going
a
back and forth with that. Go ahead.
little bit, and I think that probably came down to, if they're honest, they don't like him at the mic, but they couldn't see anyone in the draft or in free agency that they liked there, so that they're going to give him another shot, and the other spots are easy to fill. So then it became, if they're going to play Cole Holcomb at the mic, they needed a Buffalo nickel,
Hmm.
the popular term that has become one of the buzzwords in
That's taken over Twitter. Exactly. But go ahead.
yeah, and then they lost their defensive tackle depth, and I
Hmm.
thought that was a need for them. I wouldn't necessarily have done it with the second round pick, but
Yeah.
we'll get into that. But
Hmm.
that was obviously a need for them, and kind of just general depth around the rest of the roster.
I agree.
So yeah, I think once they started shifting from, we need a Mike linebacker to, well, Cole Holcomb can play that, I think it started becoming pretty obvious that they weren't going to go down a linebacker route, certainly early on.
Hmm.
And so then the needs became kind of, do you want that extra receiver? Do you want that backup tackle? You need that backup, tight end and all these kind of things. So
Hmm.
it became more depth stuff.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. So Washington walking into the draft sitting at 11, were you more of like a cornerback kind of guy? Were you a wide receiver kind of guy? Like who was the prospect that you really were eyeing at 11 from Washington?
I liked the receivers. Chris
Hmm.
Olave, I was pretty public about really liking Chris Olave.
Hmm.
And I liked other guys too. I liked Drake London. I did like Garrett Wilson, but I liked Olave more
Hmm.
because I thought he was more polished, and his deep threat will always be a value to any offense that he goes to.
Mhm.
And you could make the argument they needed more size or
Mhm.
to complement the other guys. But you know, yes, it's nice to have that, but whatever you're doing, if you have Terry McLaurin on one side, he will get extra coverage. If you have Chris
Mhm.
Olave on the other side and he doesn't get the extra coverage, he's going to be going deep and getting open. So then teams have to stop cheating to McLaurin and either play a guy in the middle and not cheat, or play two guys back deep, and then you can open up the run games and other stuff. So
Mhm.
I always thought that he would add a good dimension to any offense. So that's why I liked Olave. I wasn't quite on the cornerback train, not that early.
Mhm.
When they play that amount of zone that they did last year, then the value in cornerback isn't in the first rounds. The
Mhm.
guys that go in the first round, certainly in the top 15 or top 10, are
Mhm.
guys that are length, speed, can play press,
Mhm.
can guard the number one receiver on their own, and that's just not the type of defense that they try to play. Certainly, it wasn't when they had success last year. So, yeah, I wasn't looking at a cornerback myself.
Yeah, and in addition to that, too, the two top cornerbacks everyone was talking about, Stingley and Gardner, went in the top 10 anyway. Washington didn't really have a chance at
Sure.
them. So is that,
Yeah.
was McDuffie or something like that, right? So,
Yeah.
so Washington traded back. They went from 11 to 16. Were you a fan of the trade? How'd you feel about that?
Yeah, I like that trade. You hate to see them lose the kind of three guys that they probably would have hoped would have fallen to them
Who
in
would you have taken?
obviously.
Jameson Williams, Kyle Hamilton? What would you have done?
Yeah, I mean, any of those, the Olave, Williams, and Hamilton were probably the three that they would have liked to have fallen
Hmm.
to them, and clearly they like Doxson kind of as the guy behind
Hmm.
that group. But um, yeah, it hurt to see those three go off the board back to back to back and not last to them. But I think the overall value of the trade was still probably worth it. And when you work out, like, it meant that they walked away with all these extra players,
Hmm.
and the drop off from, say, taking Olave at 11 to Dotson at 16. Yes, there is a drop off in my opinion, but
Hmm.
it's not so significant that it's worth losing out on all the other players that they got, or certainly all the other picks. We'll see whether the players become the players that they can be, but the value in terms of the trade back, I thought was pretty good.
I think Washington, like they had a couple people in mind, Olave, and they had Jameson Williams in mind, maybe even Hamilton potentially at 16. I think they were going to go wide receiver anyway. I think they were caught off guard with like the probability of that actually happening, right? Like one of these guys would probably fall to 16, and then bang, 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 all of them kind of flew off the board right there. So, would you have rolled the dice with Williams, or were you kind of scared of the ACL? How'd you feel about that? Do you think it would have fit here in Washington? How do you feel about that?
Well, I mean, his explosive type of playmaking fits anywhere really.
Yeah, that's right, right.
If you can't make use of that, then you shouldn't be an offensive coordinator in the NFL. So he should have fit anywhere. I think the concern with his fit with Washington would be how healthy could he be? How quickly could he get back to full health?
Hmm.
And a lot of people were talking about he wouldn't be ready till November, and then even then, that's not necessarily 100%. That's just healthy and cleared to play, but he's not then back up to himself until probably next season. So if it was year one of Rivera and you were looking long term, then yeah, you could do that. And then I think that's why the Lions did that, because that they have long term stability in terms
Hmm.
of it's only the second year of that head coach GM combination. But with Rivera going into the year three and having bigged it this offseason up as we're going to take a big swing at the quarterback, we're going to take a step up like we did in Carolina in year three, and
Hmm.
all of that kind of stuff. I think it would have been tough for them to take a first round pick that wasn't going to be ready to contribute right away.
Gotcha. So what are your thoughts on Dotson? Was he a reach in your opinion? Are you happy with him and his fit in Washington? Like what's your perception so far? I know it's early. He hasn't even walked on the field yet, but
Yeah,
what are your thoughts?
I like the player. I think he brings not too dissimilar skill set to Chris Olave. He's
Hmm.
a little bit more versatile in that he'll go into the slot and go over the middle a little bit more than Olave would.
Hmm.
Whereas Olave was more of he did go into the slot, but he was still more of a vertical threat and ran a vertical route tree.
Hmm.
Whereas Dotson can do that, but can also go into the slot and run the stuff over the middle if you need him to, or if you want them to, which I think they will. So I don't think he's a bad player at all. Is he someone that I think most teams would have gone 16 is what his value is? Probably not.
Hmm.
And maybe it's only 5 or 6 picks too high, but
Yeah.
um, and if he's the last receiver of your kind of, they call it their stack that they have of first round guys, if he's the last guy of that and then it drops off, then you take him. But um, clearly they had him graded highly, and I think most teams would have had him graded kind of in the mid-20s. So
Hmm.
it's not like they've reached for a third
Like an
round guy,
outlandish.
but
Hmm. Yeah.
yeah, it's whether they could have, they talked. Mayhew talked about possibly being able to trade back again and acquire more picks. It's whether, obviously, we don't know what those offers were, but if they
Hmm.
could have dropped back another 5 picks maybe and added a few more and then landed him there, then I think we'd be talking about it as really good value.
Hmm. Very, yeah, exactly. So walking away, I feel like Dotson kind of has that demeanor of Terry McLaurin, kind of at like that leadership quality. And I think Ron was definitely looking at that strategy. His whole like theory going into the draft, it appears to be getting these like fourth, fifth year players that have been around for a while that are established, that basically have played a lot of football and more of like a higher floor kind of player there. So I definitely see that. Do you think Dotson's going to be more of a slot kind of guy, or do you think he'll bump out to the outside or out to the boundary, or
I
how do you
think
think it's all shake out?
He can do both, and I think he will do both because
Mhm,
Scott Turner likes to move his guys around, and he
mhm,
likes them to be versatile. And Curtis Samuel can do both,
mhm,
and to a degree, Terry McLaurin could do both. So I think they'll move them around, and I think he'll learn probably the Z receiver spot, which is the opposite to McLaurin, who's the X,
mhm,
and then the slot, and then it will be a lot of Dotson and Samuel kind of shifting between those two spots. And um, on one play it might be Dotson in the slot, one play he might be outside. And
mhm,
I think he'll probably run a vertical route tree a little bit better than Curtis Samuel does
mhm.
when he plays the Z. So he might be more of a Z than the slot
Okay.
in terms of comparison with Samuel.
Mhm.
But I mean, it's not like Samuel's a slow receiver or anything
No,
like
not
that.
at all. Yeah, not at
He
all.
he, he can still be a deep threat, but I think in terms of his route running ability, Dotson runs a better vertical route tree. And by that, I mean, obviously, you need speed to run the go routes,
Mhm,
but he
mhm,
can get off the line quickly. He can set up the routes with his tempo, and he can widen the angle of a post route to get a corner to open up and give him space to break inside. And um, he can wait. He can run the comebacks and the curls and the all the kind of stuff that you run off of a vertical route tree.
mhm,
That when defenders are like, okay, he's going deep, I need to bail, then he suddenly breaks off. Like that stuff, I think he does really well. So I think he'll fit as the Z as well, pretty well outside. But he can go in the slot and run the other stuff as well. I think that's part of the appeal of him. He's versatile and he can do kind of both things. He can run deep and clear out things for you, or he can move into the slot and you can have McLaurin or Samuel clear out, and he can run the underneath thing in the vacated space. So I think he's pretty versatile in that regard.
I do. I think Dotson's going to come in. We've heard over the past couple of days post draft interviews saying that he's probably the most pro ready. Him and Olave are basically the most refined. I do see a lot of good things with Dotson. I do see that he has a great route runner. He has a pretty good catch radius. He's not Garrett Wilson esque, but you do kind of see that like that little light. He can reach out and grab it a little bit as well. I do think he'll be on the field week one, and I wouldn't be surprised if he catches maybe 40, 50 balls this year. So I'm pretty excited about that. So I think he'll be a good draft pick. But the whole debate whether value and importance. We'll see how that goes. I mean, really, if you're contributing and you're adding to the team from the week one, you can't really hate on that. Before we go on to Phil Mathis, though, Mark, is there anything that was like a glaring weakness to you? Because I actually read your Substack breakdown on him. Do you feel like there's anything that's like a big concern for Dotson, or do you think he's pretty well refined altogether? What do you think?
I think he's pretty well refined. The main concern will be with his size is getting off press coverage,
Hmm.
and the physical corners that will go up on the line of scrimmage and press him um, will be a challenge for him. And he was a little bit inconsistent. There were times when he let guys into his chest and really jammed him, and he got basically completely smothered out of a play. But there was also
Hmm.
times where he anticipated that and he showed real good quickness to kind of use a stutter at the line or a jab step at the line and release cleanly past the press coverage. So I think he has the potential to, develop some different release techniques and probably work with McLaurin, because McLaurin was kind of in a similar boat when he first came out. So
Hmm.
I think he will develop that. And I think in the long term, he'll be fine. In the short term, they can do a lot of things to avoid press coverage. You can send him in motion just before the snap. You can
That's
stack him
true.
behind, they could stack him behind Terry McLaurin or Curtis Samuel in the slot, or, if they wanted to use a bunch set, he can be off the line as one of the two behind the point guy. And,
Hmm.
they can do a lot of things to help avoid a jam on the line of scrimmage. So I don't think it will be a hugely significant issue for them, but it will be something that he will probably find the most difficult thing for him to adjust to is consistently avoiding that press coverage.
Gotcha. Do you have a strong opinion on Scott Turner? How do you feel about him?
I like Scott Turner, and I like his philosophy. I think he's been quite limited in what he can do to a degree because of his quarterbacks.
Hmm.
And that's not to shade Taylor Heineke or anyone else they've had in the past few years, but they've just not been able to connect on the stuff that he's called. And every week it felt like there was a couple of plays where Terry McLaurin was running deep wide open, or someone was breaking across the middle and into vacated space, and the quarterback just couldn't find them. And so I think with Wentz and the arm strength that he has, he will bring more verticality to the offense, which is traditionally what that offense is built around. Certainly, it's what North Turner's offense was built around, and I don't think Scott Turner's had the opportunity really yet to show that his offense is built around that as well. So I think he can be a good offensive coordinator. I think he can be a good play caller. Sure, there are some things that people don't like, and I understand the running from the gun on third and short. Like, I get that's a thing people don't like,
That's a
but
Commander's Ruskin staple right there. I know they've been doing that for years for some reason or another. I have no idea.
yeah,
But
there are reasons behind it, and it gets the ball in the back's hands quicker and gives him an opportunity to read it out a little bit quicker. But
yeah.
I know that people like to see you line up and power up the gut on third and short, and just overpower people. So yeah, there's those things, and then there's the trick plays that he runs where people I think people have too much of a tendency to be results based on those trick plays. Like,
Hmm.
if it's a fundamentally sound play, it shouldn't matter whether it comes off or not. If he calls this trick play and the whole defense completely gets sold by it, but it relies on, like, I don't know, Logan Thomas throwing the ball to Taylor Heineke and Heineke drops it, or Thomas sails it over his head,
Yeah.
that's not the fault of Scott Turner.
It's
Like, he's designed
execution.
a good play. He's got a wide open play. It's just poorly executed. So
I'd be pretty
um,
disappointed if Taylor Heineke was running routes on our team anymore. So hopefully that doesn't
that's
happen
true.
anymore.
That's
Yeah,
true.
but I
But
feel you. Though. I just see where you're coming from there.
yeah, so I think the trick plays, like, he calls them in situations where teams wouldn't be expecting them, which is when you want to call those, like
Hmm.
on third and short. And it's the thing where if it doesn't work, people go, "Oh, he's being too cute," but it's not. It's those situations on third and short. Everyone's thinking you're running up the gut, so why not call a trick play? Or in the red zone, everyone's like, "Okay,
We're
we've
gonna
got to
sell out for a
defend."
bunch or something. Yeah.
Yeah, we got to defend the end zone and protect that, and then rally down to the ball. But if you can get everyone going to one side of the field on a trick play and throw it back the other way, then suddenly you've opened things up. So I think those are fundamentally at the base of the kind of idea and the concept of them. I think they work, but
Hmm.
I do understand when they fail, they look bad.
Gotcha. Gotcha. All right, let's move on to the second round, right? So the Washington Commanders, they dip into that Alabama well one more time. We add Phil Mathis to the whole dynamic there. Um, there are a couple of names on the board. There was Chad Muma on the board, Trey Anderson on the board, Jaquan Brisker on the board. Um, there's a pick your flavor, right? There definitely was options at 47. Were you happy with the pick? Or did you think it was a big disappointment? Do you see it now? Like, where do you stand on this whole pick right now?
Uh, I I didn't love it at the time, and having watched him, you can justify they needed defensive tackle depth, but that was
Hmm.
kind of like putting out their own fire, because they they kind of mishandled the whole Settle Ionitis thing once they
Hmm.
made the Carson Wentz trade.
Hmm.
So by letting both of those go, they needed the depth, and I said kind of jokingly during the offseason that it wouldn't be a crazy idea if they took Jordan Davis at 11 because
Mm-hmm.
he's such a good defensive tackle, such a good space eater, and he would allow them to do a lot of different things up front, and it would future-proof the defensive line if Deron Payne's leaving next year and what have you. So um, I understand the idea of taking a defensive tackle in the second round. Just don't love the value of the guy that they got
Mm-hmm.
because he. I know he got 9 sacks, and a lot of people have been tweeting me saying he got 9 sacks. He must be a
Yeah,
good
they've been
pass
saying
rusher.
it to me too. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sacks is not a relevant. It is to a degree, but it's not the only statistic that tells you how good or bad a pass rusher is
Mm-hmm.
because a lot of sacks can be a case of he's their worst rusher, so we left him on our worst blocker. Or,
Mm. That's a good perspective. I gotta keep an eye out for that. Okay.
yeah, well, so there was one of his sacks that I watched where they did a lot of stunts at Alabama, and he was
Mm-hmm.
often the guy that was stunting to the edge to contain and let the edge rusher loop in behind him and try to get a free run inside.
Mm-hmm.
And so when he would stunt to the edge, he would get stonewalled pretty easily by a right tackle. But
Interesting.
occasionally, a team would leave a tight end on him. If they were running a play action concept and the tight end was staying in, he would stunt outside and the tight end would have to try to pick him up. And one of
Mm.
his sacks happened when the tight end picked him up and he destroyed the tight end. But you would expect any defensive tackle to destroy a tight end. So,
Yeah.
like, yes, that was a sack, and yes, it still counts as a sack in its production. But like, you would expect that from any defensive tackle against any tight end. So, it's not a true representation of how good of a pass rusher he is. He didn't have to set up some kind of move by using different moves throughout the game, or he didn't have
Mm-hmm.
to, use great hands to get them placed exactly where he wanted to. He didn't have to use a swipe to clear the hands of a blocker and any of this. He just literally ran by a tight end. So, and that's not to say all of his sacks were like that. He's someone that is a very good run defender, and he's very good at what he does. And if they want to play three defensive linemen like the fronts that they had last year, where they played the 5-1 scheme with only Cole Holcomb at the linebacker and 5D line, then he could play nose tackle, or
Mm-hmm.
he can play up and down the line. Really, he can play
Mm-hmm.
any of the techniques you want him to, and be a very stout run defender, keep linebackers clear, all that kind of good stuff as a run defender. I don't think he has hit his ceiling as a pass rusher. I think there are some upside that he hasn't really tapped into as a rusher, like his arm length. He's got something like nearly 36-inch
Yeah, I
arms, or
saw that actually. I did see that too.
yeah, that is quite rare, especially for an interior defensive lineman. Like,
Mm-hmm.
most interior offensive linemen have 33-inch arms or less. So,
Mm-hmm.
and that, to an average fan, that might not sound like a lot, but in the NFL, that's huge, and
Mm-hmm.
that's huge because if a defensive lineman can stick his arm out and get it in your
Blast you,
chest
push you
and
back.
hold you off, they
Mm-hmm.
can't reach you.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't think he made use of that. He didn't use any kind of long arm rush, and he occasionally flashed a few little hand moves, but not consistently. And with his length, he should be able to, swipe nicely and clear hands and get by guys before they can reach him. So I think there is some upside there, but it's going to take some coaching and what have you to maximize that. And if he doesn't maximize that, then he's just a solid run defender, and that's not a bad player. He will certainly make an impact, but it's just, is that the best value in the second round? Could that have been someone that you got in the third round or
Mm-hmm.
fourth round?
Yeah, I totally agree. I actually was doing a little bit of research myself, and Zerline actually had a great like great analysis of how he felt with Phil Mathis. He said he dents the pocket. And I was like, what does dents the pocket actually mean? And when I was watching it, look at that with that large hand movement, kind of creating a little dent and kind of like basically breaking the whole circle for like protecting the quarterback and kind of creating some chaos on the inside. He seems more of like a persistent, more of like an annoyance, a nuisance in regard to pass rush, as opposed to an explosive person that could run down and track down the quarterback. So I do see that there. Do you see him as an eventual replacement for Deron Payne? Like, would you re-sign Deron Payne, or how do you feel about that?
I From what he is now compared to what Deron Payne was coming out, I
Hmm.
would say that there is a pretty significant difference.
Okay.
And I would take obviously Deron Payne, and Deron Payne was a first round pick compared to
Hmm.
Mathis, who's a second round pick that we're debating could have been a third or
Third
fourth,
round pick. Yeah, exactly.
So like there is going to be a difference, but um, yeah, I think it would depend on what the pass rush upside is and whether you feel like you can develop that. He has a really slow first step. He consistently is late off the ball, which is weird for a guy that's mostly a nose tackle that lines up directly over the ball and should be able to see it and be the first to react. So
Exactly.
um, he's got a slow first step, which you don't like, and he
Yeah.
doesn't use his length and that's a bad combination as a pass rusher. So he needs to really refine that. And if he doesn't, then yes, he can occupy guys and you can use him on stunts, but I heard someone, I can't remember who, someone said the other day that he was very selfless at Alabama and
I
he,
did
he
hear
was
that.
used
Yeah.
on stunts and stuff. And yes, that's great, but Washington would use Daron Payne and Jonathan Allen on stunts the entire time. And just because they were stunting didn't mean that they were out of the play. Like quite often, Jonathan Allen got sacks by stunting into a guard so hard that the guard would be stunned and he'd be able to break through himself. So, just because you're sent on a stunt doesn't mean that you can't then generate pressure afterwards. So, I don't fully buy into that. And obviously, it's nice that he's willing to be the guy that lets other people get the sacks and the recognition, but that doesn't that's not an excuse for not producing yourself.
Gotcha. Hey, Mark, real quick, what's your process in regard to scouting players? So, like Phil Mathis, for instance, like, is there like a certain number of hours you put into watching the players, a certain number of games? Like, what's your process in regard to like, I'm going to break it down and watch this guy, and like, that's where I feel comfortable giving an analysis. What's your thought process behind all that?
Yeah, there's no like certain number of hours. It's usually 3 or 4 games. I like to get 4 games on
Mm-hmm.
every player. Quarterbacks are a little bit in their own category. You like to watch as many games as possible with quarterbacks, but
100%.
with other players, you usually like to get, or you'd like to get 4 games,
Mm-hmm.
if that's possible. It's not always easy to source the all 22 for college players, but getting 4 games if you can gives you a real good understanding of a player. But sometimes you get an understanding from like 2 games or 3 games, or sometimes you get a real good understanding in the first game. Like Mathis showed a repeat like technique against run defense where
Mm-hmm.
he would stack up blockers consistently using the same technique, and he'd be a really good two gapper by stacking them up and giving himself the chance to go either way. And he'd stack, he'd peek, he'd shed, and he'd make a tackle. And that's kind of textbook, and that is kind of textbook for most Alabama defensive linemen because that's what they're
Mm-hmm.
taught to do.
Mm-hmm.
So you kind of knew after one game, like that's what he's going to be as a run defender. You know what you're getting there, and that's fine. So it wasn't that I still watched 4 games on him, but like when you get an idea that that's what he is as a run defender, you kind of start focusing on other things. You focus on the pass rush, and you focus on what does he do when it's screened? Does he give up and stay inside, or does
Yeah.
he
Mm-hmm.
show
High
motor
motor.
and
Mm-hmm.
get outside and that kind of thing? So and that's what he is. Yeah, he is a very high motor guy. He never stops sprinting, which is obviously
Mm-hmm.
a plus in his book. So yeah, that's kind of my process, is to try to get 4 games on prospects that aren't quarterbacks,
Mm-hmm.
and you know try to get an idea consistently over those 4 games of what they do well, what they struggle with, and then you try to apply it to how Washington tries to play and use that type of player. So yeah, that's kind of my process.
No, I gotcha. Being a permanent captain for Nick Saban and being part of that Alabama program for a couple of years, definitely to come in, pretty refined, pretty, have some leadership skills. So he should be able to contribute, pretty consistently. Let's pivot. Let's do one or two more players. We can kind of wrap it up real quick. So,
Sure.
moving along with number 3, round 3, Brian Robinson the third, or sorry, Brian Robinson Jr. Excuse me. Do you feel that, like, for one, do you think running back was a need? Let's kind of go this. Like, was running back a need? How do you feel about Antonio Gibson? We'll start off with that.
I think they probably wanted another guy in there.
Yeah.
I like the 3 that they have with Gibson and McKissick and Jarrett Patterson, but
Hmm.
you do understand that Gibson did have fumble issues last year, and he's had health issues both of his seasons.
Hmm.
Um, and during that win streak that they had, they were a ball control offense, so they were
Hmm.
running the ball a lot, and he was suddenly bumped up from 15 carries a game to 25, and that's a significant jump in workload. So
Hmm.
um, they needed someone else that could carry that, and that's not McKissick's game. You like him. McKissick is a better runner than he's given credit for, but he's also so good at the third down back role. You kind of want to
Yeah.
keep him to that. Jarrett Patterson, I think, showed some good stuff, and I would like to see him given more carries, but at the same time, like the concerns that left him undrafted about being too small and maybe a little bit fragile because of his size.
Hmm.
Would he be able to take on the workload? I don't know.
Hmm.
So I think in general in the third round, I'm fine with taking a running back.
I
For
agree.
Washington, though, I think maybe they could have waited, but
Okay.
I understand like it wasn't necessarily a need for them in the third round. But I don't have any issues in general with. I know there's a lot of people that talk about value with running backs. I think third round is fine for running backs in
I agree.
general. It's just whether Washington felt like Antonio Gibson had enough question marks about him to give him that competition or the the 1-2 punch that they like to call it with an extra back.
No, I agree. So I think all your analysis is fair. I think Antonio Gibson, I like his upside. I do like his pass catching ability. I do think with a heavy workload, he does kind of take some kinks and kind of lose some like diminishing returns in regard to what he can produce. So I do kind of like giving him a blow there. I do think the third round is a nice sweet spot to find running backs. Like, we're starting to see the value of running backs go drop more and more every single year. It might even be in the second year in a row where a running back wasn't taken in the first round. It's starting to become more of a prevalent option, something that we're seeing every single year. So getting a running back in the third round really isn't that bad for me. Um, I think you and I might be on the same page because I read your article about Brian Robinson. But do you think he was the right guy? And a lot of people are on Twitter kind of talking about like, hey, he's a Peyton Barber replacement. I see more than that. I think he's more of like he can definitely take on more of a workload. So let's kind of touch on that. Like, let's talk about Brian Robinson. Tell me about his like. Did you like him in college, and do you think where's his role? What's his role in Washington? You think?
Yeah, I did like him in college. I didn't study him before the draft
Hmm.
individually, but I watched obviously like Jameson Williams
Hmm.
and a couple of different players that were playing on defense against Alabama. And every
Hmm.
time I watched Alabama's offense, Robinson did make a couple plays that kind of made me go, "Oh, that's a nice run. That's a good player there."
Hmm.
And so I was aware of him and then studied him. I think he's a good player. I think he will contribute to Washington this year. He's definitely more than that Peyton Barber short yardage back.
Hmm.
And yes, he can do that kind of stuff, but I think he's capable of handling a big workload. I mean, he just proved that at Alabama last year that he can handle the bigger workload, and the whole no fumbles and ball security and that kind of stuff. It's somewhat of a cliche, but it does matter. And um, it will add something to the offense that means if Gibson's having trouble or if he's injured or if he's had a turnover, they can take him out and put in Robinson, and Gibson would have to then fight hard to earn his touches back. So I think it works from that standpoint. I do wonder how much of a scheme fit he is, and that's not when I say that he's not a bad scheme fit. But last year they had most of their success running wide zone and tight zone.
Okay,
Certainly
that's something to keep an eye out for.
from under center, they ran a lot of wide zone, and that's where you saw those linemen get tons of movement and create these big cutback lanes. And Gibson was quite nice as they kept calling him a slasher, where he makes that one cut and go.
Hmm.
And he was really good at that. That's not something Robinson did too often at Alabama. He was more of he ran a lot of inside zone from the gun, which Washington does as well. So he does fit from that perspective, but they also run a lot of different gap schemes like power and counter, and a lot of two pulling guys from one side to the other,
Hmm.
and
A trap,
um,
yeah.
yeah, and a lot of duo and stuff like that up front. So that stuff that Washington did run a bit of last year, but not too much. Um, that stuff that they could now run if they wanted to with Robinson, but I just wonder how much of the offense they want to change with Robinson and Gibson, whether they want to. It's a balance with the run game because I kind of believe in the old school Shanahan's thought of you stick to a sort of small number of runs with the zone scheme. You run
Mm-hmm.
outside zone, you run inside zone, and then you perfect it and understand it so well that no matter what the defense is doing, no matter what front they're showing or what kind of stunts they're doing, you will know instantly just what the from practicing it so much and mastering it, you'll know the
Muscle
answers
memory.
to those different stunts
Mm-hmm.
and different fronts and stuff. You'll know who to block and who to pass off to the next guy and that kind of thing. So that's kind of the school of run game that I subscribe to.
Mm-hmm.
But there is the other school of people that think we can run all different kinds of run schemes. And,
Mm-hmm.
the Patriots have been so good at it for so long where
Mm-hmm.
they just find fundamentally sound football players
Mm-hmm.
on the offensive line and they can down block and power block and they can still be athletic enough to run zone stuff. And then whatever the defense is showing you, you can do the opposite of that. So if they're setting up to, if they got wide 9 defensive ends that are trying to stop the wide zone, then you can run power at them, or if they're setting up to stop power, you can run zone and all this kind of stuff. So that is another school of thought, and there is merit to it, but I personally subscribe to a slightly different school of thought. So I do wonder if we'll see any scheme changes with Robinson in there as well.
That is interesting. It definitely seemed like they drafted for specific roles, maybe adding a different tool or toolkit possibly with Brian Robinson, but I can see that there. So speaking of like, specified roles, right? I'm gonna kind of throw it to you, kind of dealer's choice on this one, right? So we have Percy Butler. I saw you do a little write up on him, possibly as like a Buffalo nickel or maybe a free safety or a Cole Turner. Like which one do like of those two prospects, who are you more interested in? What do you see in them? Are you a big fan of them? Are you happy with both choices? What are you thinking?
They both kind of feel kind of similar to me. I think both can contribute year one, but I don't think either will be a star year
Got
one.
you. Mhm.
And to me, it's going to be really interesting to see what they do with Percy Butler because Rivera, in his interview with Julie Donaldson,
Mhm.
was it yesterday or the other day,
I believe so, yeah.
um, where he said that the Buffalo nickel played 53% of the
I
snaps,
saw
so
that.
he should play at least 50% of the snaps, which was kind of a big tell that A, that they wanted to play the nickel, and B, that he's going to play a lot of snaps. And I don't necessarily think he's the best fit in the nickel. With his size and his speed, he's more like a corner. So
Mhm.
in that regard, he's more of just a normal nickel rather than a Buffalo nickel.
Mhm.
But I think he does his best work deep as a deep safety,
Mhm.
and as a quarter safety specifically. So
Mhm.
if they want to play the Buffalo nickel, then I think you could play Butler as the strong safety and move Cam Curl to the Buffalo nickel, and then you have both McCain and Butler playing deep as quarter safeties, and Cam Curl's in that Buffalo nickel spot underneath.
Mhm.
And I think could be the kind of the best of both worlds. But
Mhm.
yeah, I did like Butler. I think he has some tackling issues to clear up, but
I saw that. I saw some of that in
yeah,
the article.
that Texas game was a weird one because yes, he had a few little dodgy tackles in the other games, but I think I watched the Texas game third out of the 4-5 games I watched on him.
Mhm.
And like the first couple games, like there was maybe one or two, and you're like, that was iffy, but it's not terrible.
Mhm.
And then suddenly that Texas game, he just misses like 4 or 5 tackles, and it's just like this is a problem. So that definitely needs to be cleared up. But other than that, I think he's got he's got really good instincts as a safety, and he really understands the different types of coverage concepts that you can use, and not just a basic quarters or a basic cover three. It's pattern matching coverages, it's bracket coverages, it's understanding the concept as a whole rather than just one role within it, and I think that's a very encouraging sign for him.
Gotcha. I agree. So one more question. We have two more questions, right? I'm going to ask you basically about Lyndon Collins next. Then we're going to end it on Sam Howell and how you project him and how you feel about all Sam Howell being in DC.
Okay.
All right. So Lyndon Collins, and just Cam Curl in general. Do you think Washington is still in need of adding someone to play that bigger nickel role, or do you think like if you're Ron Rivera and you're a fan, you follow the team pretty well. Would you pursue Lyndon Collins and maybe put him back into the mix, maybe play the Buffalo nickel role, or do you think that's a detriment to Cam Curl and basically sets him back? And because Cam Curl, probably has better coverage of the two people right there. What do you think about that?
It depends on what kind of system they want to play. I think there's a lot of different solutions for that kind of. We'll say the 11th guy. I think they've got the kind of the front four are obviously set. You're talking, and then Jamie Davis and Cole Holcomb are going to play linebacker, and you've got McCain, Curl, and then the two corners, and then it's just whether you have a nickel corner or whether you have the Buffalo nickel or whether you have another linebacker. And I think they can kind of find a solution however they want to. Yes, they could play Lyndon Collins there. They could obviously, as I just mentioned, put Percy Butler back at safety and move Cam Curl up. Or they could put Cole Holcomb or Jamin Davis as that Buffalo nickel and find a Mike linebacker. Because if they're playing the amount of zone that they played last year, that Buffalo nickel doesn't need to be able to match up man-to-man on like a slot receiver or an athletic tight end.
Actually. Yeah.
They can just drop into coverage and play top down. And that's what Lyndon Collins did so well last year is once they reverted to those zone coverages, that's where he really excels, is playing top down on everything. And so, yes, you could certainly look into re-signing Lyndon Collins for that role. But, I still kind of think like they need a Mike linebacker that's really going to be able to make all the calls and the adjustments at the line as at the same time of being able to, play their roles in the defense. And I think we saw with James Davis, obviously, at the start of the year, and with Cole Holcomb at times, that they were just a step slow or just a little bit hesitant. Like, am I making the right call here?
Or one step the wrong direction or something.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
And whether another year in the system and a little bit more confidence and Holcomb, has been kind of made the mic by Mayhew and Hurney right now. And Rivera right now. So maybe if he goes into the whole offseason knowing that that's his spot and practices and training camp and preseason like that, maybe he steps up and maybe you don't need a mic. But I kind of feel like until he's proven that he can handle both the responsibility of doing that and playing fast, then I would still be looking at a Mike linebacker. And if you can find a Mike linebacker, then I think you don't really need Collins, because you can either play that Buffalo nickel with Curl in there and Butler playing deep, or you could call either Holcomb or Davis because they're both athletic enough to play that zone role.
I agree. I think it's gonna be a really interesting dynamic to watch the linebackers this year, because I do think that they do have good athletic profiles. Because Cole Holcomb, people kind of overlook him. Like, you keep thinking of Jamin Davis as that athletic freak, but Cole Holcomb has some good height, weight, speed as well, right? Definitely, he can handle his own.
Sure.
What I found was pretty interesting. I was listening to Logan Paulson and John Keim yesterday. John Keim predicts that of the two linebackers, if one was going to play that that Buffalo nickel role, he suggested Cole Holcomb out of the two, which I thought was pretty interesting because Davis is supposed to be that faster guy, but Holcomb is pretty smart and has been around for a little while, so I do see that there. And I am kind of curious to see how Mathis affects the linebackers, right? He's that two gapper that should open up some holes for them. And Davis was a read and react linebacker. Like, obviously he wasn't refined out of Kentucky, but he does have that downhill kind of thumper. Like, for what he is, he can definitely bring that part to this game. And I am kind of curious to see how that plays out. Real quick, I know you and I talked about AJ Klein. Is AJ Klein, do you think he could potentially be a good fit for Washington? Have you dove into him yet or not really?
I've watched a little bit of him. I watched a little bit of him before free agency because I figured that they'd look at obviously former Panthers and Bills guys.
Commanders, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So, he's someone that obviously knows the system and can play his role within that system pretty well. And he's probably not a Mike linebacker, but he probably knows the system better than anyone else that they could bring in at this point. So if they're going to go with a guy that, doesn't really play the mic, but hoping that he'll know the system like they do with Cole Holcomb, then maybe you bring in AJ Klein and let him do that and let Holcomb stay outside. Or, as you've mentioned, go to that Buffalo nickel spot. I think he's a good player. He's not great in coverage, but he can certainly diagnose run plays and react to those quickly. And it's tough to say exactly how many like different calls and stuff he made in Buffalo because he wasn't like the regular starter there. So he probably wasn't the guy with the green dot making all the calls, but that doesn't mean that he wasn't, making
He
signals
can't.
and seeing
Mhm.
things and stuff. Yeah, as you say, he can't. It doesn't mean he can't. So, I think they should bring him in or someone in just because they don't have any depth behind
Mhm.
those
Mhm.
top two. So
Yeah, it's
they
true.
certainly need bodies. So a reliable vet that they can trust, that they knows the system, makes a lot of sense to me.
All right, let's bring it on home. Last question. So, wouldn't be a Washington football podcast without talking about the controversy at the quarterback position. I, I personally don't think Sam Howell is going to really threaten Carson Wentz, but I guess I'm more of the ilk of just kind of talking about Sam Howell. Like, were you a fan of him in college? Do you think he has long term potential here? Are you more of like, I want to ride Wentz for 3 years? What's your thoughts on Wentz? I haven't really talked to you about that. Or do you want him to fulfill his contract? Are you more of like a 1 year trial person with him? Like, kind of give me a perspective on the quarterback position.
Yeah, so with Hal, I haven't studied him fully yet. I've
Okay,
managed to get a hold of some film from both 2020 and 2021.
nice.
So I'm planning to basically spend the weekend watching him,
There you go.
and do a write up on him next week. But um, with Wentz, I think once you make the trade for him, I think
You
that's when
committed.
you kind of you kind of commit to that, and
Hmm.
you should. For me, they should have. I know that for the long term future of the franchise, the best thing to do with Wentz was to keep him on his contract to give you the out next year if it goes wrong.
Hmm.
But the long term future of the franchise isn't necessarily tied to Rivera and Herney and Mayhew.
That's true.
So those guys, in my mind, if they feel like they need to win, they should have, spread out that cap hit along those 3 years that he has left. Said, right, well, we've made the trade, we're committing to you, and then made some extra moves in free agency, or get someone like Terry McLaurin signed a little bit earlier, so that
Hmm.
that price tag of the wide receivers doesn't go up before everyone in free agency goes nuts and signs Christian Kirk to stupid contracts and what have you. So yeah, I think once they made the move for Wentz, they probably should have also moved the contract and made themselves some more cap space to do some more things. But um, certainly for if you're not a believer in Carson Wentz bouncing back, and to me, them not changing the contract suggests that they're not really.
Hmm.
They're just
I
hoping that he can be solid and better than Heineke, and be the 15th or the 16th best quarterback in the league, and
Yeah.
hope that that's enough with the team that they have, that they can get to the playoffs, and it might well be.
Gotcha. Gotcha. So, Mark, thank you for everything. You've definitely been very patient with your time. I really appreciate that.
Mhm.
You are just a patient person in general. I see a lot of people will definitely give you your praise and your critiques on, on Twitter all the time. This is kind of the nature of the beast right there.
Yep.
To kind of bring it on home, kind of talk about, where they can find you on social media, what upcoming projects you have, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so my Twitter handle is at Mark Bullock NFL. So you can find all my tweets there. And I'm doing articles on Substack, which is markbullock.substack.com. And it's a subscription site, so you do have to pay £5 a month. Sorry, $5 a month, not pounds. But that gives you access to all my articles, and yeah, all of my breakdowns and all the draft picks. And so I'm currently working on Cole Turner. It should be a post tomorrow morning on Cole Turner. And then, as I said earlier, I'm watching Sam Howell over the weekend, and hopefully at the start of next week, I will have something on Sam Howell.
And guys, I can vouch for Mark. I don't subscribe to a lot of things, but I do subscribe to his Substack. It's actually great. It's one of my evening reads. Definitely learn a lot from him, and he's a great follow on Twitter. So definitely take a look at that. Guys, that's it for today. I'm George Carmi from Full Press Commanders Podcast. You can follow me at Carmi21. Thanks for listening. Talk to you guys soon. All right, guys.